For the folks that are here, I just want to thank you all for being here. Again, Lisa Ranglin, currently serving as president for the Rhode Island Black Business Association. And you are at our virtual Zoom event, Black in Business in Rhode Island. And I am sure when we leave from this place tonight, we're going to be so happy that we joined this session. We're going to be, I'm not in church, so I can't say that. We're going to be richly blessed by the knowledge that we will walk away with. And I think we're hoping, you know, as we think about what COVID has done to the Black business community, I think I'm hopeful, and I know for sure, I don't even have to hope because Keith and I talked about this, it is going to be so rich, and I think we're going to feel so fired up and pumped up to go out there and do so much more for our community. Growing Black businesses, we know Black businesses are the backbone of our communities. So I am just so excited. When I talked with Keith about this presentation, just the very, short piece of it that he shared with me, I was like super excited. And I said, as we, think about moving into Black History Month, why not kick this off in January, knowing that Reba is going to be celebrating her 10th year in March, and we're going to lead right into a celebration for that amazing milestone. But certainly thought, January is, presents itself really well for us to do so much as we think about what has happened within our community. So again, thank you guys so much for being here. I think all of you, 10, yeah, okay. So again, thanks for being here. I don't think for the folks that I see on this call need any introduction of Mr. Keith Stokes. We all know him, we love him, and he's just an amazing professional. I think he has a wealth of knowledge. You'll hear all of that from him, but certainly has done tremendous work in Rhode Island, and you can see his bio, a part of the invite that had been circulated over the last couple of weeks. So again, I want to thank you all for being here. Certainly you could have been elsewhere, but you took time out of your schedule to be here with us today. And I'm so super excited about that. But I have to give a shout out to Amanda Roman. She's our Director of Program Development and Operations, and she did a fantastic job coordinating this event with Keith, and here we are today. So before I'm not gonna keep talking. So Keith, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Feel free if you want to share anything else around introduction, around your organization, feel free to do so. And then let's dive into the presentation.
Thank you, Lisa. And it's great to be here with the Rhode Island Black Business Association. And I hope that we're going to probably spend about 40 minutes providing about 350 years of history of Black history. But I will say that the images that you see represent scores of primary, secondary documentation that have come from our partner organizations, including the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, Rhode Island Historical Society, Newport Historical Society, and many others. And we're blessed in this state to have these types of historical institutions in the amount of work that they've been able to do to recover our history. This program is going to focus on 3 separate areas of the Black experience, and particularly the Black entrepreneur experience. We'll begin with the 18th century and how African heritage people arrived in Rhode Island. We'll then travel into the 19th century during the Industrial Revolution. And then we'll end about in the middle of the 20th century, about up in the time of World War II. But each and every one of those sections will give you a sense of what we now call the creative survival, how African heritage men, women, and families were able to persevere despite enslavement, despite Jim Crow laws, despite discrimination, to this very day. And in fact, when you look at outstanding organizations such as the Rhode Island Black Business Association, it is a direct descendant of some of the founding Black business organizations and the men and women who founded it that you're going to hear today. So I'm excited about this presentation. I look forward to any Q&A that people might have. I will ask at the end if there's questions that people might have, I'll leave my email, and feel free to reach out to me, and I would certainly love to respond to you and provide you access to a very large bibliography of primary and secondary sources that we've compiled for this presentation and many others that we do. Let me start with a very important premise, and that is slavery is not Black history. I'm going to say it again. Slavery is not Black history. Black history is how our African ancestors survived and thrived despite enslavement. And the story today, Black in Business in Rhode Island, is an evolution of the survival of our Black ancestors. And those men and women through the 18th, 19th, and 20th century were able to build a life in institutions despite arriving in the worst circumstance. And what's important to recognize is that when we begin the starting point of Black history, it does not start with slavery. It does not start with European colonization of the African continent. In fact, African heritage and history exist eons before any whites would step foot on the African continent. And as we understand this, we need to recognize is that well before European colonization, that there were major empires, particularly within West Africa, that had existed, that had culture, that had science, that had technology, and most importantly, had a whole assortment of craft skills that would later be transported with them to the New World. In fact, what we now know as scholars is that the lion's share of Africans who would arrive in what is today Rhode Island arrived from, at the time, called the Gold Coast, what today we recognize as largely Ghana. So what's important to recognize is that as these Africans were transported from old world to new world, they brought with them so much more than their labor. They also brought their craft skills, their capability and technology to apply those skills, and all of those skills and crafts as African entrepreneurs, as it was brought with them to the new world, to places like Rhode Island, would help build this great state, this great country, and really the entire Western Hemisphere. So I want to provide an introduction of the 18th century, and I think it's important to recognize that that introduction did come through human enslavement. And it's important to recognize that the earliest Africans that arrived here arrived through what is called the transatlantic slave trade. I've been able to work with scholars from across the African diaspora, and we now have a database of every documented slave voyage that originated from Rhode Island. What we now know is that between 1705 and 1807, what some scholars call the golden age of Rhode Island's maritime trade, that 100-year period, we now know that there were at least 934 documented slave voyages. And they transported close to 150,000 African men, women, and children from the African continent to the Western Hemisphere. And in this database that we've been able to develop, we've broken it down by not only which community, but by owners of vessels, number of Africans transported, and destinations. So what we now know is out of the 934 slave voyages that are connected to Rhode Island over that 100-year period of time, close to 72%, 672 came from my town of Newport, and then a smaller number from Bristol and Providence. What's most important is that, as I had said earlier, the Africans that arrived here largely from what is today West Africa, but specifically from what is today along the Guinea and the Gold Coast of West Africa, from what is today recognized as places such as Nigeria, Ghana, into Sierra Leone. What's most important, and I'm going to talk about this because it's important that you recognize this, these Africans did not arrive as blank slates. They brought with them their language, their culture, their religion, their labor, and most importantly, their entrepreneurial spirit and technology. And that's really what the theme of the presentation tonight is. We also know through research, and I had the honor 2 years ago to travel to Africa at the invitation of the African Cultural and Historical Society, and actually physically go to several of the slave fortresses along the Ghanaian coast that are directly connected to the Rhode Island trade. In fact, we now know that the most important slave fortress where enslaved Africans were captured, maintained, and then shipped eventually by Rhode Island merchants and ships through the Middle Passage to the West Indies and some back to Rhode Island is now tied to a place called Ananabo. Ananabo is about 30 It's about 30 kilometers north of Cape Coast. Cape Coast Castle and Fort William and Ananabo are the two most active slave fortresses connected to Rhode Island merchants. What's most important is that at the time, Ananabo was populated along the coast by the Fanti tribes. And the Fanti tribes, working with Ashanti tribal members, were complicit in working with European traders, Rhode Island ship merchants, in capturing, transporting fellow Africans. But what's most important is that many of the Africans that would eventually survive the Middle Passage to the West Indies and survive travel and transport to Rhode Island brought with them a very important cultural tradition. Those that were from the Akan people, basically Fanti or Ashanti tribes, would bring with them a very important tradition that we see to this very day. And it's a day naming tradition where, based on the day of the week or your birth order, you're giving a name. So if you are a boy that is born on Wednesday, your name is Kwarko or Kwaku. If you happen to be a boy on Friday, it's Kofi or Cuffy. And we have literally in Rhode Island alone, thousands of these day names of African men, women, and children that once lived, worked, and worshiped, and eventually died in colonial places like Providence, Bristol, Newport, North Kingston, Smithfield, Narragansett. So one of the most important aspects of understanding this history is the fact that we're able to reconnect through a very important cultural custom Africans before their enslavement and directly back to their African origins, in some cases tribal origins, in what is today Ghana. It's also important to recognize a very important point. The Africans that would arrive here, along with indigenous people placed in enslavement, for the most part, were working on industries that was based upon a colonial New England and not an antebellum American South of the West Indies. As we can see with the weather today, Rhode Island, being in New England, has very inclement weather, very bad soil, and it is not the place to have and build an agricultural-based economy. So when many of us think about African slavery, we tend to think about, in the Americas, we tend to think about rice plantations in the Carolinas, tobacco plantations in Virginia colonies. We tend to think about sugar and coffee plantations in the West Indies. Well, none of those types of cash crops are going to be grown in the inclement weather and the bad soil of New England, particularly Rhode Island. So many of the Africans that would arrive here, rather than working on large agricultural-based plantations, many of them are now being trained and oriented to trade skills to provide and meet the needs of colonial maritime economies, particularly in places like Newport, Providence, Bristol, Rhode Island, New London, Connecticut, Boston. So what we now find is that by the peak of the 18th century, by the middle of the 18th century, by the 1750s, Africans are being sorted and brought to Rhode Island specifically to be trained as tradesmen and tradeswomen. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of this research is many of the Africans that were brought to Rhode Island were very young, many under the age of 12. I can't even begin to think how a 12-year-old or younger child could survive the transatlantic passage, but they did, and they arrived here. And once they arrived here, they were placed into very specific years of training in trades. My own ancestor, an 8-year-old boy in 1795, is trained as a Windsor chair maker and later a cabinet maker. And by the very nature that these young Africans are being placed in trade skills, they have access to language, they have access to education, they have access to resources that would have been unheard of and unnecessary for enslaved Africans who would have landed in, say, Charleston, South Carolina in a rice plantation, or in Jamaica in a sugar plantation. So let me be clear here. Africans that arrived here may not have been placed in the very horrendous circumstance of plantation economies and plantation lives that we see in the West Indies and certainly in the Southern Americas, but they arrive here as chattel property. They're enslaved. Their lives are limited by the whims of their master and mistress. They simply have opportunities based upon our economy of the time that gives them access to language, in education, and work skills that would have been unheard of for Africans who would have landed further south. And what's important to recognize is that as these Africans arrive and learn these skills, they're involved in nearly every aspect of building and supporting the maritime economies of Newport, Bristol, and Providence. In fact, in Newport alone, my community, many of the existing colonial buildings were built by enslaved and free Africans. But one of the things that we remind people is that these buildings, such as Turrell Synagogue, the oldest existing synagogue in North America in Newport, the Old Colony House, the fourth oldest existing state capitol building, the Redwood Library, the oldest lending library, the Brick Marketplace, each and every one of these buildings today are recognized as historic architectural masterpieces. Well, if we're going to recognize the historic value of those buildings, shouldn't we also recognize the African men and women, skilled labor that built them and maintained them? These buildings wouldn't exist today as masterful architectural craftswork if it wasn't for African men, women, and children. And just to give you an example of the trade skills that evolved within these Africans is I'm going to give you several stories, several of dozens upon dozens that we've uncovered of African men, women as tradesmen in early 18th century Rhode Island. This story is of Pero Bannister. Pero Bannister is in the household of John Bannister. John Bannister is one of the most active merchants and traders in Newport in Rhode Island in early America. Today, his wharf, which is recognized as Bannister's Wharf, is probably one of Newport's most favorite spots. I'm sure everyone's had a chance to have clam chowder and enjoy themselves and shop and see the harbor. Well, the next time you're in Bannister's Wharf, recognize the fact that Pero Bannister, an enslaved and later free African man, set up and operated an oyster house, one of the most popular restaurants of its time on Bannister's Wharf. So Pero Bannister, even though arriving in the worst circumstance, was able to parlay his technical skills and translate that and transfer that into a business as an entrepreneur, as an oyster house operator. And as we look broadly, we see that enslaved and free Africans are operating oyster house restaurants in not only Newport, but in Providence, Boston, New York, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. One of the most, I think, important stories and one of the most well-detailed stories of an early African entrepreneur in colonial Rhode Island is a woman named Duchess Comino. Duchess Comino, who is buried in Newport in our Gods of Lakers section of our African burying ground in her family section, arrived from, again, what is today Ghana, from the Gold Coast as a teenager. She's enslaved in the household of William Channing. William Channing is the Attorney General for Rhode Island at that time. And as a part of that household, she's trained as a cook. The fact that William Channing is a prominent public official, he is hosting every other day, it seems, events at his house. And this Duchess Comino becomes a very adept, not only cook, but a large service cook, where she's cooking products and services from entrees to main courses to more her specialty, her pastries. Duchess Comino in this household learns the art of pastry making. And later, as a free person, she becomes an operator of her own business in Newport and uses the proceeds to finally purchase not only her freedom, but the freedom of her surviving children. Today, Duchess Comino is recognized as the pastry queen of Rhode Island. And what's most important is that she converts eventually to Christianity. She becomes a member of the Second Congregational Church and a pious member. And a little boy named William Ellery Channing, who grows up in the household and grows up under the life of Duchess Comino, later becomes the founder of what is today recognized as the Unitarian Universal Church, and becomes one of the early abolitionists of Rhode Island and Massachusetts. And William Ellery Channing actually etches on her marker, calling her one of the most pious and exemplary and astounding Black women he's ever met, and would recognize his life with her and her influence on him in helping him to become the abolitionist and the universal humanity of all men and women equal under God in the life that he would live. So again, even though Duchess Comino arrives in the worst circumstances, an enslaved chattel property, she would rise up to create a business and create, most importantly, an investment in herself and her family, and influenced an entire community. And one of my favorite stories is a man named Neptune Thurston. Neptune Thurston arrives again from what is today Ghana, the Gold Coast. He's enslaved in the household of Reverend Gardner Thurston, who was the Reverend and pastor of the Second Baptist Church in Newport. He's trained as a barrel maker or a cooper. And as a barrel maker, this Neptune Thurston actually eventually becomes free and owns his own home, which is on Long Wharf section of Newport. That home was later relocated and exists today in our Point section on 41 Walnut Street. This Neptune Thurston has an art of imagery, and he actually carves images of different characters from hogs to parrots on these hogshead barrels. Well, one of the great Newport stories, this story goes back generations, is that this young boy named Gilbert Stewart was literally learning the art of creating images by watching this Neptune Thurston. And this Gilbert Stewart, growing up in Newport, would later become one of America's early portrait painters. And he would be recognized for painting the portraits of some of the many of the early founding families and founders of early America, including George Washington. And in fact, George Washington's most favorite portrait, one exists in our state capitol, a second in the old county house, is used for the image for the dollar bill. So the next time you use a dollar bill, or the next time you see a portrait of George Washington, not only thank Gilbert Stewart, thank Neptune Thurston, who influenced that young boy in colonial Newport. And it's important for us to recognize that as these Africans would arrive, and they brought with them their skills, their language, their religion, their culture, even though they were enslaved, they still found time to begin organizing themselves so they could reclaim and maintain their African identity. We now have primary, secondary records that go back to at least the 1740s, where we begin to see, starting not only in Newport, but in Providence, North Kingston, Warwick, and then across New England in places like New Hampshire and Connecticut and Massachusetts, every June, Africans enslaved and some free would come together and they would organize themselves and they would elect a tribal leader, which the white community interpreted as a mimicking of white elections. It eventually was called either Negro Election Day or African Governor Day. But each and every June from across New England, Africans who shared a tribal identity, language identity, cultural identity would come together and they would elect through a series of ceremonies their African leader for that year. These events would recognize the fact that Africans arriving in the worst circumstances, enslaved property, would still have the opportunity in New England at the very least to be able to organize themselves and recognize their very important African identity and cultures. In Rhode Island's case, we have dozens and dozens of Africans who are listed from year to year across the 18th into the early 19th century as African governors in participating in these Negro election days. In fact, in Newport alone, we have a Pompey Brenton who's trained as a clerk in Governor William Brenton's household. So he's literate. He's actually well engaged on political issues. He's elected several times as an African governor. And he's also buried in God's Little Acre in our African burying ground in Newport. And if you look at his marker very carefully, look very carefully at the angel at the top. The angel has African features. It's a very important testament that Pompey Brenton, who once lived and worked and served as an African governor and eventually died in colonial Newport, didn't look like George or Martha Washington. He looked like a proud African man that he was. And by the end of the 18th century, by the conclusion of the American Revolution, Rhode Island joins other New England states in the gradual emancipation of slavery. And by the end of the 18th century, slavery has largely died out in Rhode Island. There are still pockets of those Africans held as slaves, but for the most part, it has died out. So now you have, in a very short period of time, a large number of now free Africans. And these free Africans largely populated in, at the time, what is called Narragansett County, then Washington County, today South County, pockets of Bristol, pockets of Providence. The largest numbers in Newport are now free. And unlike Africans further south in the Americas and certainly the West Indies, they have access to language, religion, trade skills that give them an opportunity to build lives and identities well before their counterparts elsewhere. And what you begin to see by the end of the 18th century is that free Africans begin to come together and create their own independent African institutions, almost an evolution of the Negro Election Day ceremonies of years before. And in fact, as these African institutions are being established, the one thing that they have in common is that they call themselves not Negro, not Black, not colored, but African. And these earliest African organizations are called African societies, African churches, African Masonic Lodge, and African schools. And starting in Newport on November 10th, 1780, and how do we know this? Because the original record still exists as a part of the collections of the Newport Historical Society and the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society. On November 10th in 1780, a group of African tradesmen who are free come together and they form for the first time in world history the Free African Union Society. This African Union Society is incorporated. It's led by a man named Abraham Casey. Abraham Casey is an African man who is listed as a master chocolate grinder. He is grinding and producing chocolate on behalf of several merchants in Newport and later in Providence. And Abraham Casey, joined by men such as Cuffy Mumford, Okama Mariku, Bristol Yama, Nubatike, Quashmart, come together and they form this organization. What's important is that 1780 date predates the emancipation of slavery by several years in Rhode Island, Connecticut, Massachusetts, and New Hampshire. What's most important is that once these African men in Newport form this organization, they immediately reach out to fellow free Africans in Providence, Boston, and Philadelphia. And between 1780 and 1789, free African societies are organized and chartered in each of these communities. What's most important to recognize is that each and every one of these free African societies would immediately, over the next several decades, evolve into early Black churches. So the origins of free Black churches are directly tied to the origins of free African Union societies in America. And many of these early institutions are starting not in Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, not in New York City, not in Savannah, Georgia, but places like Providence and Newport, Rhode Island. And in the case of Newport, that early free African society would eventually evolve into the Union Congregational Church. And in the case of Providence, the African society would evolve eventually into the Coggan Street Baptist Church, which is the first and oldest free Black church in Rhode Island and one of the earliest in America. And the congregation still stands proudly to this very day. So as these free Africans are now organizing themselves, they have trade skills. In Providence, they become very focused on establishing themselves and building their own meeting house. In fact, the early African men that formed that African society by 1789, they have names like Cudge Brown, London Spear, James Mackenzie, Bristol Oney, Bonner Brown. They're living in the east side of Providence at that time, along what is today College Street, Benevolent Street, to Water Street, South Main to North Main Street. And one of the most important things they do as an African society is decide that they will have their own free place of worship. At that time, many Africans, as was indigenous people, were converted into Christianity. The challenge is that you might be African or indigenous and worshiping in a Baptist church or a Quaker meeting house or an Anglican church, but you were almost always left to the back of the room and out of the service. So you were members, but you were certainly separate and unequal members. So by 1819, African men had come together in Providence, led by the men who founded the African Union Society, and also Black tradesmen, men like Alfred Niger, a barber, George McCartney, who ran a grocery business. These men came together and had access to capital. They had strong sense of their African identity and decided, if we are going to be Christians and we are going to be worshiping God, we will worship God freely under our own place of worship. And in 1819, they came together through a gift of Moses Brown and acquired land on Meeting Street. And over the next several years, they would construct and build and complete an African meeting house and schoolhouse. That African meeting house and schoolhouse would later evolve into the Coggan Street Baptist Church. But what is most important is it becomes one of the first early free Black non-denominational meeting houses where Black men and women and families could worship freely without white oversight and organization. So it really leads us to the 19th century. The 18th century, we overcome slavery, we build trade skills, we're starting to build African organizations. And now the challenge, particularly in places like Newport and Providence and Bristol and South County, is how do we build a life as free African citizens? One of the things that we see in the 19th century is a great transition in the economies. Because of the American Revolution, because of the disruptions of the maritime economy, Newport ceases to become a major competitive maritime center. In fact, by the early 19th century, Providence, with the advent of the Industrial Revolution, is now coming on as a major American city. And we're finding that now free Africans and now Africans of American descent are now relocating from places like New London, Boston, New York, Newport, Bristol, and they're all coming to Providence. And they're bringing with them their trade skills, and they're bringing with them their opportunities to build new lives. And Providence now becomes a major center in the early 19th century of Black life in early America. It's literally College Hill section of Providence. It's the Beacon Hill section of Boston. It's little communities in Philadelphia and New York that are growing quickly, all become these enclaves of free Black life in the early 19th century. And in the case of Providence, many of these Africans are settling along the Cove or the waterfront area. If I could take you back, the Cove is very much where Water Place Park is, going on to the lawn of the State House and where the train station is and train tracks. And many of the African Americans who either lived and even in some cases owned property at that time were living in the further northern outreaches of the town of Providence. So in the north section of the Cove, places today, if I could give you a sense of the hardscrabble community, as it was called, would have been somewhere between North Main, Canal Street, running up towards the State House and the train station. Later, Snowtown, which would have run from where the Providence Marriott is up towards Only Street. At the time, the northern sections of the town. And one of the things we've been able to do is go back and look at primary, secondary records and be able to reconstruct where African heritage people lived, worked, and worshiped during that early 19th century in neighborhoods such as Hardscrabble and Snowtown. And as you can see from the list here, many of them as men are laborers, many of the women are seamstress or dressmakers, but you also have a number who are involved in the maritime industry. Looking at documents very carefully from the 18th and 19th century, about 20% of the mariners and seamen listed in Rhode Island and New England are of African descent. So it's the maritime trades, and again, from transport vessels to whalers to China trade vessels, we see African heritage men plying a trade and working a living as mariners. As these men and women begin to organize themselves, they begin to organize other institutions. And in Providence, Alfred Niger and George Willis, two tradesmen who are founders of the early African Meeting House, who are business leaders that live along College Street and Benevolent Street. By 1826, they begin to organize a second, and most importantly, chartered Prince Hall affiliated Masonic Lodge called the Harmony Lodge. We have those original documentations. What's most exciting is that Harmony Lodge would evolve over the years, and the men who would serve as members of that Prince Hall affiliated lodge were not only lodge members and loyal Masonic members, they are leading business, political, civic, religious Black men of their day, leading to the very day. Alfred Niger and George Willis are also very organized around national issues. Between 1824 and 1831, largely in the Black enclaves of Hardscrabble and Snowtown, there are a series of horrific race riots that destroyed large parts of those communities. Alfred Niger and George Willis, by 1831, traveled to Philadelphia, and they joined with free African trade men from across the country to form the first Free Persons of Color Convention. And why were these men coming together? Because the number one threat facing free Black communities in the North was race riots. As Providence weathered race riots at Hardscrabble and Snowtown, New York City in the Lower East Side, Philadelphia in the 7th Ward, Baltimore, Boston, and Beacon Hill had all weathered similar racialized riots where white community, majority community, was deconstructing Black freedom, Black prosperity. So by coming together as a Free Persons Convention, this would be a forerunner of Black people coming together and organizing themselves to promote their civil rights and equal rights and protect themselves through unity in numbers. One of the great complicities of Rhode Island by that early 19th century, and it's been always interesting to me because people focus so much on Rhode Island's complicity in the slave trade, which is deep and diverse, but very few people realize that as Rhode Island was peaking in the Industrial Revolution, Rhode Island was also participating in a direct complicit relationship in providing the clothing for enslaved African Americans in the plantations of the Lower South. Rhode Island manufacturers, textile manufacturers, were leading the country at that time in producing what is called Negro cloth. Negro cloth was a very coarse woolen fabric that was used for the clothing of enslaved African Americans on cotton plantations and rice plantations of Mississippi, Alabama, and the Carolinas. There are at least 84 Rhode Island manufacturers who have been identified of producing this Negro cloth. So even though Rhode Island was a free state, an anti-slavery state, Rhode Island leaders of commerce, of religion, of leading families were still prospering and prospering quite well by their complicit relationship of outfitting the slave labor of the American South. And one of the most important aspects of understanding this history is that as the textile industry was booming, African-American men and women were excluded from working in those textile mills. So if you were an African-American man or woman in 19th century Rhode Island, living and trying to prosper in places like Providence, your option for working in a mill did not exist. So you had to be an entrepreneur, you had to look elsewhere to build an identity, to create an industry, and most importantly, create an economy for your family and your community. And we have hundreds of examples of African Americans now living in Providence and working in Providence and operating a number of businesses and such. In fact, this map that we're creating is a map of actual African American entrepreneurs who have established businesses in Providence between 1820 and 1840 during that antebellum period. And if you look at the map very carefully, you notice there's a cluster, a linear cluster, which really suggests that many of these businesses were operating on what is at the time Water Street and what is today South Main Street as it moves into North Main Street. But we also have African Americans setting up businesses on Atwells Avenue, on Broad Street, on Wade Boston Street, and on Westminster Street. What's most important is that even though African Americans are weathering racialized riots, discrimination of employment, they still have the fortitude, the trade skills, and the entrepreneurial spirit to create their own businesses and their own economic prosperity. And one of the things that we've been able to collect, and we'll be creating an online exhibit working with Rhode Island Black Heritage Society later next month, is a whole exhibit of Black entrepreneurism in Rhode Island. And we have wonderful images of African-American men and women taking out ads in Providence-based and Newport-based newspapers, implying their trade as hairdressers, dressers, grocers, marketers, auctioneers, you name it. African-American men and women were engaged in these businesses. And it's also important to recognize that the African-American men who were building businesses and building community in the early 19th century are also not forgetting their ties to the African diaspora. As generations before, in the early 18th century, Africans would reclaim their African identity by having these Negro election days or African tribal elections. As early as the 1850s, African Americans in Providence would come together and celebrate the emancipation by the British of the West Indies and the British emancipation. This celebration was celebrated the 1st of August each and every year, starting at Roger Williams Park, Rocky Point, and Crescent Park, well into the 20th century. In fact, we have news articles and data where 5,000 to 8,000 African-American men and women would celebrate all the way into the 1960s these Emancipation Day celebrations. And what's most important to recognize is that even though these are African-Americans living and working and worshiping in antebellum Providence, they still identified and connected with their Black brothers and sisters in the West Indies and back to Africa through these Emancipation Day celebrations. And as I provided you an example of some of the entrepreneurs of the 18th century, let me give you some quick examples of entrepreneurs in the 19th century. Thomas Holland, in this wonderful portrait, which is a part of the collections of the Rhode Island Historical Society, is today recognized as the first African-American elected to public office. He's elected as a third ward warden who would oversee elections in the third ward for one single year. Before that, he established himself on Market Square, then later South Main Street. He's working as a tavern owner, he's a grocer, he's even a stevedore. He's doing a variety of different things, but what's most important is that Howland is actively engaged in the religious community of Providence and through the meeting house, and he's actually engaged in the political system. His bold step of becoming the first African-American elected to office by largely a white majority would set the stage for generations of African-American men, then later women, who would serve public office. One of the great ironies of Thomas Holland is that by the end of 1857, he and his wife and daughter abruptly leave and decide to leave for Liberia. He signs on with the American colonization movement, leaves for Liberia. He sets up a sugar and crop cultivation business there, and then we hear nothing of him. What's most important is at the time that he left, there are African Americans in Providence who disagree with his decision. Alfred Niger, George Willis, and others decide to reject the American colonization's offer of returning to Africa because their belief was, this is our country. We have bled, we have contributed everything for generations as Africans in America, and we have just as right to prosper in Providence, Rhode Island, or America as any white citizen. So we reject leaving this state, our native country for Africa. So even though a Thomas Holland and others would leave, there are Alfred Nigers, George Willis, and others who decide to stay and fight for their right as native-born Rhode Islanders. There's also independence within African-American women. As I said earlier, this fast-growing industrial revolution in the textile jobs are particularly wide open for newly arrived immigrant women. Irish women, French Canadian women are now working these textile firms. African-American women are excluded from that work. One of the most interesting and almost ironic circumstances at that time, by the very fact that so many white women are now working in the textile industries, the elite families of particularly Providence do not have women to draw upon as their household servants and in-house servants. So a decision is made to begin to attract African-American women to work in domestic service and household services. The fear at that time was that African-American women may not possess the, I will say this genteel, the intellectual capacity, the moral fortitude to be allowed to be in a home as an in-home servant. So a group of elite Providence leaders came together and they formed in 1831 a domestic service association for the purpose of recruiting, training, preparing African-American women for domestic service. Most African-American women did not bite, did not participate. In fact, many of them would respond by saying, I have a home of my own. I have a family of my own to raise. I will work a reasonable time and hours, but I will not work full time, and I will not live apart from my family. So this Providence Society for the Encouragement of Faithful Domestic Service implodes upon itself because Black women wanted to remain independent. We may not have the best of jobs, may not have consistent jobs, but we will work for ourselves. We'll work for our own family's benefit, not for some other person's benefit and family. And possibly one African heritage woman who embodies the spirit of an independent Black woman of that time is Eleanor Eldridge. Eleanor is born initially enslaved in Warwick of both of an African indigenous family. In Warwick, she learns to be a household servant. Her brother, George, actually becomes elected as one of the Negro governors or African tribal leaders in Oppanog section of Warwick. And Eleanor Eldridge takes her entrepreneurial spirit and she literally establishes in Providence her own laundry business and owns a series of her own properties. So despite the racial and sex-based adversity of early 19th century Providence in Rhode Island and America at that time, women such as Eleanor Eldridge would step forward, establish their own business, take on racism and sexism, and create an independent life for themselves that would set the stage for African-American women to this very day. And possibly the most well-recognized 19th century entrepreneur of his time is George Thomas Downing. George Thomas Downing is originally from New York. His father had established in the late 18th, early 19th century an oyster house in Midtown Manhattan. George Downing learned from his father his entrepreneurial hospitality skills. And when he arrived to Rhode Island at Newport by the 1840s, he would establish and build his own hotel along Bellevue Avenue. In fact, an entire block, which was named after him, the Downing Block, included a hotel, retail, restaurants, mixed-use catering activity. He would then expand that business to Benevolent Street as a catering business in Providence. And then later, during the American Civil War, he was the official caterer for the United States House of Representatives. George Downing was one of the wealthiest and one of the most well-recognized entrepreneurs, Black entrepreneurs in early America. But what he did with his funds, what he did with his prosperity was immediately turn that back into promoting civil rights and equal opportunity. George T. Downing was recognized nationally side by side with Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and all of the great abolitionists and civil rights leaders of the mid-late 19th century. George Downing in Rhode Island would work with Providence leaders by the end of the American Civil War to finally integrate public schools in Rhode Island. He would work with leaders to end a ban on interracial marriages. He would form in 1869, starting in Rhode Island, what later would become the Colored Labor Union League, so that post-Civil War, newly free African Americans had the right to organize and unionize so that their interests as laborers could be best protected. The most important Renaissance Black civil rights leader in American history, next to Frederick Douglass, is Rhode Island's own George T. Downing of Newport and Providence. And as I said, this National Colored Labor Union Convention, it has its origins in Providence and Newport, and through the collections of the Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, we have business cards of Black men and women such as Downing, Thomas Williams, and many others who are operating businesses post-Civil War into the early 20th century in places like Bellevue Avenue, Newport, Benevolent Street in Providence, Beacon Hill in Boston, all as entrepreneurs, and each and every one of them taking their entrepreneur spirit and the economic prosperity that they would gain and earn and plowing that back into Black churches, Black businesses, Black neighborhoods, Black civic organizations. So that ends the 19th century, and we're going to wrap up with the 20th century. The 20th century, I think, brings a very interesting challenge for African Americans in Rhode Island and across America. By 1896, the United States Supreme Court, in its historic or horrific decision of Plessy versus Ferguson, made the determination that separate but equal facilities would satisfy the 14th Amendment. It then would legalize and sanction Jim Crow segregation laws. And as Jim Crow laws existed in the American South, Jim Crow traditions flourished in New England and particularly in Rhode Island. And one of the great challenges for African Americans in Rhode Island was fighting these Jim Crow traditions that were active each and every day and was an affront to the free life and equal life of African Americans living in Providence and across the state of Rhode Island. And in fact, by 1913, a group of African American men and women, many business leaders, would form on November of that year at a mass meeting at the Beneficent Congregational Church in Providence, would form and charter one of the earliest NAACP branches, led by Dr. Julius Robinson as the first president, Reverend C.C.L. Lane from the Winter Street Church, AME Church, as vice president, Roberta Dunbar, John Minkins, William Heathman, James Dixon, and William P.H. Freeman. Each and every one of these men and women were critical leaders of all aspects of early African-American life in 20th century Rhode Island. As an example, William Heathman is one of the earliest Black members of the bar and early civil rights leaders, along with a Joseph LeCount in Providence. Roberta Dunbar, born in Narragansett, we would relocate to Providence. Lifetime member of the Pond Street Baptist Church, Roberta Dunbar would be an early founder of the Colored Women's Clubs of Rhode Island, New England, and nationally. William P.H. Freeman, who would live in Providence on the east side on Meeting Street, would become a realtor and an insurance agent. And as a Black man, as a founder of the NAACP, he would use an insurance business and his residential business to provide access to housing for African-American people who were denied by discrimination and Jim Crow policies in Providence in the early 20th century, and provide access to insurance, to insure their homes, to insure their loved ones. So men and women like Dunbar, like Freeman, like Robinson would be able to defeat Jim Crow traditions by creating their own Black services and their own Black institutions to support their communities. And as World War I would arise, the challenges that we saw 100 years before with the Industrial Revolution of excluding women and people of color from the textile mills, as World War I would arrive and our mills in Rhode Island and our manufactories are now producing products and materials for war goods to support the World War I effort, African Americans are yet denied employment. In fact, in 1918, a group of African American women had petitioned to work at the Gorham factories in Providence. At the time, the Gorham factories were building parts within hand grenades. And many of the workers were women, but almost exclusively white women. The NAACP in Providence challenged the Gorham factory and was joined by the national NAACP and put on a national news media campaign to point out the fact that Rhode Island was excluding African-American women willing and able to work simply because of their race. And as stated in a New York Age national Black newspaper headline, this vicious form of discrimination is being practiced in Rhode Island, not Mississippi. Eventually, because of that campaign, and by the end of the war, African-American women had access to the work. And it's important to recognize that this fight at home and overseas was led by a number of critical African-American businessmen and businesswomen in Rhode Island. As George T. Downing was probably one of the most important contributors to African-American entrepreneurial spirit and civil rights, it's Providence-born Mary Elizabeth Jackson who becomes one of the leaders of promoting not only the rights of women of color to have access to work and trade and labor, but later she became a leader joining her white sisters in the suffragette and the right to vote movement. Mary Elizabeth Jackson becomes a statistician for what is today our Department of Labor and Training. She becomes an authority on data collection and empirical study of Black women and their ability to work in the workforce. She publishes articles in a whole assortment of trade associations and national newspapers promoting eagerly and aggressively that African-American women are willing and able and educated to do the work equally of any person in any job. It is Mary Elizabeth Jackson who almost single-handedly deserves credit of elevating African-American women in the early 20th century in their access to fair employment and fair opportunities. And again, this is one of our own, Providence-born, Providence-raised, an early founder of the NAACP in Newport, an early president of the Colored Women's Clubs of Rhode Island and New England, and an early subscriber and supporter of what becomes the John Hope Settlement House. Mary Elizabeth Jackson, someone everyone in Rhode Island should recognize and celebrate for her work and her contribution. The second woman behind her, a Newport woman, is a Mary H. Dickerson. Mary Dickinson would found in Newport the Women's League and would also be a founder of the National Federation of Colored Women's Clubs. Mary H. Dickinson was able to have this leisure time to do these things because she became one of the most prosperous dressmakers in Newport at that time. She operated a dressmaking shop on Bellevue Avenue in what is today the Travelers Block on the corner. Her dressmaking shop was the shop for every elite white woman coming to Newport in the summer to take part in Gilded Age soirees and parties. Everyone that wanted the best dress, the most unique dress, went to Mary Dickinson's dress shop. She would take that money and parlay that and use it exclusively to build colored women's clubs, to invest in orphanages for colored children in Newport and Providence, and become a national leader in the colored women's movement. Mary H. Dickinson, like George T. Downing, used the wealth gained through their entrepreneurial spirit to immediately invest back into their Black community. There's a direct correlation between Black wealth and Black institution building yesterday and even to this very day. And as I said before, men such as William P.H. Freeman would use his business as insurance, his business as rental, to be able to defeat Jim Crow Providence and provide access to housing and insurance for scores of African-American families across the city. And one of the most interesting things about William P.H. Freeman as we've done our work is he lived at 58 Meeting Street, and the woman, a Black woman that owned that house later in the 30s and 40s, would rent that house out as a part of the Negro Motors or Green Book. In fact, there are many structures on Meeting Street in Providence and along Historic Hill in Newport during the 30s and 40s, where Black entrepreneurs who owned hospitality and rooming houses would make those houses available as a part of the Green Book, because the largest society, including Rhode Island, is still excluded people of color for residency. And by the end of World War I into World War II, fair employment starts to pick up a very rapid pace. In fact, by World War II, as Rhode Island becomes a center of military operations, and a significant number of military construction operations are happening in Providence along the waterfront, Newport's waterfront, and at Quonset, Davisville, African Americans are finding they're yet again being shut out for jobs. So it is the NAACP and the newly created 1939 Urban League that come together, and they push very aggressively for the Rhode Island General Assembly and governor to study this assessment, to document discrimination in employment. Their sense was, their belief was, is that the documentation will validate what we have been able to deal with for centuries as African-American people. In 1943, after 2 years of study and research and documentation, a commission on employment problems of the Negro released a report, a commission led by Joseph LeCount, James Williams of the Urban League, William Heathman, John Lopez of the NAACP, and other men and women. And this report provided major findings of unfair discriminatory practices going on across the state, but particularly in our capital city. I've had the opportunity to read this report in detail. It is shocking to see what African-American men and women dealt with in Providence, Pawtucket, Cranston, Newport, across Rhode Island in not 1863, not Mississippi, but in 1940s Rhode Island. These findings were finding consistent cases of discrimination from white barbershops either refusing or charging Black customers double the amount to cut their hair because their belief was curly hair would dull their instruments. Restaurants in downtown Providence and in other places of Rhode Island not allowing African-American men, women, and families to sit at tables, but at counters, so that they could move them quickly out of the restaurant and keep space available for white patrons. And again, this wasn't going on in the 1840s or 1740s. It's in the 20th century at a time that still recognizes our parents' and grandparents' time of living in Rhode Island. And because of that effort of Joseph LeCount, and because of the effort of other African-American leaders, this report would set the stage for a focus on fair employment legislation that would be established by the end of the 1940s in Rhode Island. And as they were looking very carefully at what was going on accommodations and restaurants and services, they were also finding, as an NAACP, significant employment discrimination of African-American men and women in the labor fields and in the nursing fields. In 1944, Joseph LeCount, John Lopez, joined with a very young, wet behind the ears Thurgood Marshall, who came to Providence and filed suit at the Kaiser Walsh shipyard against the Boilermakers Union, who were discriminated against, in creating a separate and unequal membership to over 500 African-American men who were boilermakers and welders and laborers at that shipyard. The suit was won, and it set a national precedence that any labor would allow any man, regardless of race, access to fair labor rates, fair dues, and fair participations. This breakthrough legislation, breakthrough labor case, did not happen in New York or Chicago. It happened in Providence, Rhode Island, and it is a Joseph LeCount and a John Lopez joining together with Thurgood Marshall. Also that year, the Urban League, led by James Williams and a Miss S. Forster Hunt, a white socialite of the East Side, had found that African-American women were graduating high school and looking to become nurses, particularly during the war years, and contributing their fair share to the war effort, but they were being excluded at the time simply by their race. The Urban League and NAACP put together a letter campaign and an advocacy campaign and forced Rhode Island Hospital and Rhode Island Nursing School to accept colored applicants for the first time in 1944. So by the end of World War II, fair employment gains had achieved significant success because of the work of the NAACP and the Urban League and Black men and women leaders and tradesmen. And in 1949, Rhode Island would pass one of the earliest state fair employment practices law that would eliminate discrimination in the workforce. This Rhode Island Fair Practice Employment Law would set the stage to establish a Rhode Island Commission Against Discrimination, which evolved to this day to the current day Rhode Island Human Relations Commission and Providence Human Relations Commission. And if you see in this image here, the man sitting very comfortably in the seat is Joseph LeCount. And if you look down at the bottom of the screen, Joseph LeCount, William Heathman are all leaders of the Harmony Lodge of the Prince Hall affiliated Prince Hall Masons. These men and women maintained their affiliations with civic and social organizations and used that organizational skills to fight for and achieve civil and equal rights for all African Americans across the state and their country. I want to wrap it up with something of very recent history and something that is a challenge today, because I think people today sometimes think of discrimination and racism from what a John Brown might have done as a slave trader in the 18th century, but not what Brown University and other institutions might have been doing in the 20th century. And one of the great challenges and disruptions faced by African-American people, and particularly business people in the 20th century, came through urban redevelopment. Urban redevelopment was an offshoot of the post-World War II accommodations of returning vets, of being able to reduce urban blight of the urban cities and create new suburbia. And it was instituted as a federal policy and as an investment strategy alongside the federal highway bill that would build interstate highways such as 95 and 195 that would further dissect and disconnect historic communities, and particularly have devastating consequences of urban communities. Urban redevelopment activities in Rhode Island had devastating consequences in Providence to Upper South Providence, to places like Lippet Hill, College Hill, Fox Point, West Elmwood, in places like Newport, West Broadway, historic Hill. And these policies, even though they intended to remove urban blight, their unintended consequences was to deconstruct historic Black neighborhoods and communities. I want to give you a sense of what went on in one community in one period of time, which is Lippet Hill. The Lippet Hill community, which is bounded today by North Main Street and Camp Street and Doyle Avenue and Only Street, was one of the historic and oldest Black enclaves. And the Rhode Island legislature created a Providence redevelopment agency who had the authority and the statutory authority to take property by eminent domain, clear urban blight, and redevelop areas. The Lippet Hill area, which contained about 57 acres of largely residential but some mixed-use activity, was slated for significant urban redevelopment. The challenge at that time is that nearly 5,000 people, largely people of color, were displaced during that redevelopment era of the early 60s. And as Andrew Bell, president of the Urban League, pointed out, since we still have Jim Crow traditions of limited housing choices for people of color, people of African heritage across the city, if you're dislocating people from Lippet Hill, they're going to have very limited choices on where they can live. And for the most part, many of the people who were dislocated permanently from Lippet Hill ended up in Upper South Providence. And as Andrew Bell said, you've deconstructed one neighborhood and you've created a ghettoized area in another neighborhood. And I want to be clear, this urban redevelopment activity that I'll explain for Lippet Hill was going on across the Northeast. And it was a challenge that African American and limited income communities were faced with during the 50s into the 60s. And in the case of Lippet Hill, this is a GIS map of what Lippet Hill looked like from around 1952. And as you can see here, it's very densely populated. This is Only Street. You have at the bottom right-hand corner, Hope High School and the athletic fields. It's a very vibrant, densely connected community. Within 10 years of urban redevelopment, it's a ghost town. It's been completely deconstructed. Lippet Hill, once a vibrant, densely compacted, urban enclave, historic enclave of largely African-American, Cape Verdean, indigenous, and working poor people, almost ceased to exist through urban redevelopment. And in fact, one of the things that we've been able to do is create a map of the Black-owned businesses that existed in that Lippet Hill area at that time before urban redevelopment. What's most important to understand, urban redevelopment not only displaced African-American families from their primary place of life and living, it also displaced scores and scores of African-American entrepreneurs and businesses. These were Black men and women that operated hairdressing, shops, services, professional services, music, dressmaking. You can see from the list here, this is just a fraction of the men and women who actively and vibrantly operated businesses in the Lippet Hill area that all almost went away overnight through urban redevelopment. And today we see the urban redevelopment of Lippet Hill as University Heights, the mixed-use shopping center and apartment complex, which again deserves credit for its time of having a mixed income and a mixed racial environment, but it fails to recognize the history of displacement that impacted so many people of color in that community and in communities very similar to that. So what is this legacy that we have today? This legacy of overcoming slavery, overcoming racialized riots and disruptions and discrimination of the 19th century, overcoming Jim Crow traditions of the 20th century and urban redevelopment. Well, it leaves us a legacy today of being able to rebuild and reconnect our African-American history through the institutions we have. Today in Rhode Island, today in Providence, we are fortunate to have institutions such as the Rhode Island Black Business Association, Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, NAACP, and many others, because these institutions, like their forefathers before them, will set the stage of building and organizing and reinvesting in the vibrancy of the larger African-American community. So if this presentation provides you anything, I hope it provides you the one very important sense that if we are to survive as African heritage people in 2021 going forward, the key is organization, the key is investment, the key is in self-determination. Each and every one of us has an obligation to do what our African heritage men and women ancestors did before us. Invest in a Rhode Island Black Business Association, invest in an NAACP, invest in a Rhode Island Black Business Association, and build a life for generations to come. Thank you for being so patient. A lot of history in a relatively short period of time, but I'm certainly available to answer any questions I might have, and I'll certainly leave an email if anyone would like to contact me to have access to more information and documentation. Thank you, Rhode Island Black Business Association. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Keith. Oh my God, this is so rich. I wish our children were able to have this. Oh my God, I'm so lost for word. But again, this needs to be in our schools, right? We got to ensure that Black history is taught in our schools. As I sit here, I'm going to open it up. I think we're running behind time, but we may take a few questions. So rich. We will have the recording available. So I know that was a couple of questions that came, and it will be shared and also on our website. So we'll pause and get some question in for Keith. There'll be about 3 or 4 questions because we're actually behind schedule a little bit. We were supposed to end at 6:30. So go ahead, guys. Any questions from attendees? Amazing. Thank you. We appreciate it.
No Keith, actually, if you don't mind, this is Marianne Matthews. I think this is a phenomenal presentation, and I just sort of wonder, did you think maybe about sharing this on a sort of statewide exhibit for the different schools or the different community museums that we might be able to make this information available to folks?
Hi, Marianne. Yes, we're doing that. The Rhode Island Black Heritage Society will be launching an online virtual limit next month on entrepreneurs of color, where we're digitizing artifacts, objects, documents to make it available to the larger community. We're also working really hard with legislative leaders and others. Hopefully 2021 is the year that we finally have African-American heritage and history curriculum in Rhode Island. As I said earlier before, Rhode Island has some of the deepest and extensive collections of African heritage and history documentation. And we could build one of the most vibrant history curriculums in America right here in Rhode Island. We just need the political will of our legislature and our governor to step forward and support this initiative. So we're looking forward to it. We're excited about it. And we stand ready to share this information for every Rhode Islander and every Rhode Island school children.
Certainly let us know how we can be helpful to make that happen.
Awesome. There are a lot of advocacy, I'm sure. But this is awesome. Other question. Thanks, Marianne, for that. Any other questions, please?
I have a question. This is Carlene. Hi, Keith. Thank you for that.
You're welcome, Carlene. Good to hear from you.
My question is, I hear the stories, and oftentimes I think about what the camaraderie was like between Black folks in Rhode Island, and how they organized and came together. And my question for you is, what advice do you have for us on this call as to how we can come together more in Rhode Island to improve the Black business climate through, if it's initiatives, organizing, policy, like how can we do a better job?
That's a great question. I'm a strong believer in reuniting the African diaspora. The one thing we have in Rhode Island that we have not utilized is our strength in numbers. As you remember, I said Africans, when they first built their institutions, called them African societies, African churches and such. And then they evolved into African Americans. And then later in the 20th century, we became Black Americans, and today African Americans. Well, I would say in 2021, if you look at the numbers, African heritage people constitute a significant portion of the population of Rhode Island and the fastest growing population of Rhode Island. If you use the term African heritage, that includes Cape Verdeans of African heritage. That includes indigenous people of African heritage. That includes Latinos and Latinas of African heritage. That includes biracial, multiracial. So if we were able to build a coalition around our shared African heritage throughout the African diaspora. I mean, you can come from Newport or Providence, you can come from Kingston, Jamaica, Bridgetown, Barbados, you can come from Dominican Republic or Nigeria or Ghana. We all share an African heritage. And I think if we were to build a cultural and even a civic and social identity around the diaspora, we have the numbers. And with those numbers, we can start to elect people to represent us. We can start to invest in businesses and organizations that support our best interests, and we can make a change. So again, I'm only suggesting we do what our ancestors did 100 and 200 and 300 years ago quite well.
Yeah. Powerful. So much work to be done. That's a great recommendation in terms of how do we mobilize and how do we ensure that we're working together collectively. Other questions for Keith?
I have one. I don't know if how to say this best, since it's my first time on Zoom, so I'm a rookie here. First off, I do want to congratulate all involved, especially Lisa and Keith. I've met you many times over the years, and you continue to make all of us feel part of the equation. So that I want to salute you. The thing I want to ask you is, in a sense, is there going to be sometime maybe along this theme, bringing in nearby Connecticut and nearby Massachusetts into how they affected the Black businesses? Because as you know, a lot of times successful figures were not just Rhode Island alone during these last 200 years.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm actually doing a lecture next month with the Black Businessmen organization in Boston. And I've had great dialogue with counterparts in Philadelphia, New York, and elsewhere. There's actually significant amount of documentation in Rhode Island that shows a direct connection between early Black institutions, organizations, both from religious to civic to particularly Prince Hall Masonic, that connect those communities all through that time. Again, the challenge is that much of this history has been hidden or buried because we haven't valued Black history. Or we've seen Black history confined to 1 month of the year. In fact, the month that has the shortest amount of days in the year. So I think it's very important going forward that we see this not as Black history or Rhode Island history, it's American history. And by learning the history of America through the eyes and lens of African heritage men, women, and people across the diaspora, you'll have a better appreciation of everything that we take for granted today. So it starts with education, it starts with curriculum, but the good news is all the primary, secondary documentation and collections are right here in Rhode Island and ready to be released and reviewed and celebrated.
To follow up on that, Keith, one thing that's too bad is there's also a misrepresentation of events in history too. I'm a descendant of the Boston Tea Party, and what I was told years ago about the Boston Tea Party versus what they're telling you now, it worries me how they always keep away from all the misconceptions of history, and that's why again I commend you what you're trying to do. You certainly made me learn a lot today, and I'm sure others have as well. I just hope we can continue to always find ways to bring the humanities side of our history, past, present, future. There are a lot of positive things that we need to know instead of having this feeling that the news or any part of our media has to lead and leads. You definitely have given us, each of us, I hope, a reason to go forward. And like Mother Luther King said it best, we cannot walk alone. Here we saw it today, and more fun to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much, Gus. Look, one last question, and then Keith, if you could share your contact information as well.
Yes, I did.
Oh, awesome. So one last question, and then we're going to wrap up. We're a little over time. I want to thank you all. One more question, please.
Sorry, can I ask a question? I don't know if anyone else was ready. My name is,
go ahead.
Sorry, my name is Liddy. Once again, thank you so much for this information. I've missed this from being in school, and I feel like whenever I get this information, I get super excited about what I'm doing in terms of work. How can you make this information something that is available to kids? So I work a lot with, I'm a psychotherapist, so I work a lot with younger kids and teens, and I find that sometimes they don't want to hear this information because unfortunately it's being given as like something that's to be shameful or have guilt over rather than things to be proud of.
No, I mean, that's a great question. Certainly, I've been working with a number of historical institutions, particularly Rhode Island Black Heritage Society, and they're going to be coming out with, again, more virtual exhibits and online exhibits as we try to manage ourselves through COVID safety protocols. But I will tell you, we have some really neat programs coming up. We've done an assessment and survey of Fox Point, and we're reconstructing the Cape Verdean community there. We're also doing things in Newport and reconstructing some of the early African-American communities there. So please reach out to me, and I'll certainly point you in the direction of what online exhibits and virtual programs will be going on over the next several months. But I ultimately feel that the absolute priority here is building a sustainable African-American history curriculum for all K-12 public school children. If you don't know, you should know, much of this work's been done. Rhode Island Historical Society, our Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, formed a commission to bring together scholars to develop this work, to begin to be able to identify units of instruction. So a lot of heavy lifting has been done. And as I've said earlier, and I just want to emphasize, the primary secondary records are right there in our historical institutions, and they're ready for us to be able to extract and put together into programs and services and educational learning opportunities. We need the political will. We need our legislative leaders to stand forward and adopt this, not tomorrow, not in a few years, not when we have a better budget, but today. And I can't think of a better present for 2021 Black History Month, but to initiate legislation to do exactly that. So call your legislators, urge them to put in legislation, urge them to do the work. And I think every child in Rhode Island will prosper from it.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. So we're going to close on that. Thank you, Keith, so much. This information is so rich. I mean, oh my God, we could stay here and listen to it all night. But again, we want to be mindful of time. We apologize for running over. But again, this has just been such an incredible night. Awesome information. Great job. Thank you so much. Again, I want to thank you all for being here tonight. We encourage you to get involved with the Rhode Island Black Business Association. You can find our information on social media, on our website, all of that. We encourage you to join. We're actively recruiting for board of directors as well as members to serve on our various committees. You can find that online. In addition, we have several programs that's upcoming. Please check those out online. Share the information and get involved. As we heard earlier, together, stronger together, we can do so much, but we must work together. We saw the examples of men and women came, together and did so much. So I'm sure we can do that in the 21st century. So again, guys, thank you so much. Stay tuned. We'll see you soon, virtually, I'm sure, in the next coming months. But let's do this. Join our advocacy committee. Let's help Keith and all the other folks out there working to bring this to our kids and to share this information across our state. Take care, stay well,